My name is Professor Sue Rogers. I'm Interim Director of the UCL Institute of Education. A very warm welcome to the IOE and a belated Happy New Year to all of you. It's good to see so many of you here today, and I'm sure others will join us. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Tak Win Chan, Professor of Quantitative Social Science at the IOE. Originally from Hong Kong, Wing completed his first degree in Sociology, Politics and Philosophy at the University of Hong Kong. From there, he moved to Oxford University to complete his doctorate, which looked at social mobility in his home country. Postdoctoral positions at Oxford and the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin followed. Since then, Wing has held academic posts at the University of Oxford, Surrey and Warwick, and now UCL. Wing has been awarded many prestigious Research Council grants to examine the interactions between social status and consumption and intergenerational relationships. He's currently part of a large international project comparing life course and family dynamics across China, the Netherlands, Germany, the US and the UK, for which he leads the UK research team. Alongside his research, his wide-ranging examining, for example, the impact of family size on educational attainment, the social gradient of autism spectrum disorders, and racial discrimination in the labour market. What unites Wing's research is its use of large-scale, nationally representative data sets, from household panel surveys to the UK's Census and National Pupil Database, to reveal trends and correlations that can help us better understand society and each other. And when it comes to understanding each other, there is perhaps no better cause at the moment than that of Brexit, which is what Wing will focus on this evening. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Wing to present his lecture. Wing.
Thank you for coming. Especially since the nation has decided to get Brexit done. There is still some mileage to try and understand why we are where we are. And because I think a lot of what people said about Brexit is not quite on the mark, as I'm going to try and persuade you. Before I start, I'd like to understand the audience a little bit. Who among you are not from academia? Thank you. Helpful to know. Okay, so it's joint work with colleagues. Two of them are in UCL here, Morek Henderson and Maria Cironi. Morek is over there. Fourth colleague is Jutta, who is now based in Stockholm. So the credits go to them as well. Question, please direct at me. So people support leave or remain for a whole range of reasons. Many issues were raised in the Brexit campaign. For example, the economic consequences of Brexit, immigration and the impact of immigration, and of course, take back control, right? So, but there are basically two main narratives about people's vote for Brexit. The first says that Brexit is a revolt of the economically left behind. The second narrative says that Brexit is really a revolt, a resurgence of an English nationalism. So this paper is really an attempt to evaluate both narratives to see how far they take us to understanding Brexit. The left behind argument. So usually start with a map like this, and the commentator will say that the economically more deprived area have higher leave vote share, and so Brexit is driven by people who were left behind. So this is an article published in The Guardian right after the morning after the Brexit poll by John Harris. Very good journalist. If you got money, you vote in. If you haven't got money, you vote out. The pictures are a bunch of kids and the dog outside a burnout shell of a house, right? So this is a sort of Brexity area, left behind. Yeah. There's a lot of academic support for this view. So Diane Koh is a professor at Cambridge. For her, Brexit is a vote against globalization and its uneven impact. Kevin O'Rourke is professor of economic history at Oxford. Kevin also said that Brexit is an anti-globalization backlash. And David Runciman is a professor of politics at Cambridge. He says people who are relatively affluent voted Remain, the disadvantaged voted to leave. A lot of academic support for the left behind view. There are also political figures, senior politicians, saying the same thing. So this is an interview Corbyn did with the German magazine Der Spiegel just over a year ago. Der Spiegel asked Corbyn, if you can stop Brexit, would you? And he said no. And then Der Spiegel asked, but Corbyn also said we could understand why people voted for Brexit. Der Spiegel asked, so why? And the answer there is all these left behind community. Some people, some community have been left behind. That's why we got the referendum outcome that we got, right? The best or the most articulated version of the Brexit argument come from the MIT economist David Autor. Autor has a research project, very important, in which he point out that the success of the Chinese economy has really big impact on local labor market in the US. China is manufacturing a lot, shipping all over the world. It hurt particular community in the US. And since local labor market differ in their initial industrial specialization, some are more exposed to the Chinese impact, the import shock of China than others. And those more exposed community, according to Autor, they see higher unemployment rate, slower wage growth, lower labor market participation, and so on, which in turn has political consequences. One consequence of that is political polarization. He said that communities which have seen larger Chinese import penetration, they are more likely to remove congressional representatives who are moderate in their opinion. So you end up with extremists in Congress. He also made the argument that China import to the US contribute to Trump's election. He argued in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the key battleground states, as the American would say, would have elected Clinton rather than Trump had import penetration to the US 50% lower. Now, 50% lower is a lot lower, right? But that's the argument. On Brexit, two Italian economists, Colantoni and Stenik, basically adopted the framework of Autor. They argue that import from China is the structural driver of divergence of economic performance across the UK. People who were displaced, workers who were displaced by Chinese import, they were the left behind. Yeah. What they did empirically, this is a big paper which appeared in the American Political Science Review. They use a Chinese import index, measure it for the UK, for different parts of the UK, and then match it to data from the British Election Studies Internet Panel. And they show that, control for people's education, gender, age, etc. If you live in an area with a lot more Chinese import, you are a lot more likely to support Leave in the Brexit referendum. So for him, geographically concentrated economic distress driven by the Chinese import led to an increase in Brexit support. Yeah. So this is one way of thinking about Brexit. It's an interesting argument, and we will look at that argument with data later on. But I want to flag up some issue about thinking about deindustrialization in the US and the UK first. So this is actually a graph taken from one of author's paper showing the share of employment in manufacturing outside farming in the US, going from 1939 to 2014. On the left here, top left, that bit is the Second World War, right? It jumped around a little bit. At that time, about a third of the US workforce outside farming were in manufacturing. What you see is that straight after the Second World War, the US has been deindustrializing, continuously, almost in a straight line, right? Until 2008, when Barack Obama was elected that year. That year, just over 8% of the US non-farm workforce, 8% were in manufacturing. Yeah. So the deindustrialization of the US happened a long, long time ago. China did not become a major exporter of manufactured goods until the 1990s, right? Round about here, right? So the timing is a little bit out. What about the UK? So this is a graph I take from the ONS, which use Bank of England data. The yellow line in the middle is the size or the share of employment in the secondary sector. It's a broader definition than just manufacturing, but roughly tell the same story. So after the Second World War, secondary sector go up a little bit and started to decline round about mid-1960s when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, right? So the deindustrialization of the UK also happened a long, long time ago, right? The other thing I want to say is that in the Brexit debate, the concern for local economic distress that is related to globalization is really about immigration rather than offshoring of industry, isn't it? A few years ago, we are not talking about industry leaving the UK. We're talking about, labor coming to the UK, right? And the sort of proverbial Polish plumbers, they work in non-tradable sector of the economy, don't they? So if you have a blocked toilet, you get a plumber to your house to sort it out, right? You don't rip it out, send it to China, and send an unblocked toilet back to you, right? So that's not the tradable sector of the economy. So there's a little bit we need to think about this argument. So the second narrative about Brexit is that Brexit is really about identity, not economics. The thing about national identity is that it's multi-layered. People can identify with different things, right? You could be thinking of yourself as a European as well as British, right? You don't need to be either or. We don't have that data about how strongly people feel about being European or British in the data set that we analyze, but we do have some data about whether people think of themselves as British or English and so on. So I want to use that a little bit. On national identity, what is interesting, Scots, Welsh, they tend to prioritize being Scottish or being Welsh over being British. Not so much for the English, at least traditionally. Yeah, they are equally likely to think of themselves or call themselves British or English. Yeah, there has been some change round about mid-1990s. Some said it's to do with the devolution, the asymmetric way devolution happened in this country. But perhaps the reasons could be more complex. But in any case, a higher share of people living in England call themselves just English than maybe 20, 30 years ago. that is relevant because for many people, Englishness is slightly tinged with some sort of regressive, conservative, and have some ethnic character to it, especially to ethnic minorities and migrants. Britishness is a less racialized identity that they could identify with. So what we want to do in the part of the analysis is to show you how people who call themselves British rather than English, or British and English, how they differ in their Brexit vote. My argument is that for people living in England, those who call themselves British rather than just English are probably taking a more broader outlook. But I don't want to explain attitudes with attitudes, because that is sometimes, you know, the dependent variable and what you want to explain the dependent variable is maybe too close to each other. So one of the things I want to do is to explain Brexit with a behavioral measure, what people actually do. And I took the that behavioral measure in some data on cultural consumption. What do people do for fun? Yeah, in terms of music, in terms of you know, leisure activities. So we carry out some analysis and reduce classify the sample of the data into three types of cultural consumers. They are the cultural omnivores. They consume highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow. They just eat up everything. Yeah, and then there are cultural univores. They only do popular stuff, and there are in-between category called cultural pulchivores who consume a little bit, but not as much as the omnivores. We think cultural omnivores are essentially sort of like they are quite Catholic in their taste. They just don't mind trying things out. And if they are, in that sense, more tolerant people and have a general openness to other styles, cultural styles in this case, that may say something about, you know, their general outlook. It turns out that cultural consumption is related to what psychologists call the big five personality traits. Cultural omnivores are more open and less conscientious. Right, so are you a cultural omnivore? It turns out that openness as a personality trait and conscientiousness are related to social and political attitudes. In particular, there's some research which suggests right-wing authoritarianism and something called social dominance orientation are related to a less open outlook and more conscientious outlook. And American researchers suggest that these two traits are also related to support for Trump. So we would, you know, infer that cultural omnivores may be more pro-Remain because of their particular outlook. Another argument that have been floating around is this. It says that people who voted for Brexit are, you know, they suffer from a kind of status anxiety. There's a paper by Gitron and Hall. They use a measure called subjective social status. This measure is very straightforward. They give you a ladder with 10 rungs, 1 to 10, and then they ask you, place yourself somewhere on this ladder. Where are you in society on this ladder? And their argument is this. In many countries, middle-aged, not very well-educated men, they have been losing social status measured by this ladder over the last 25, 30 years. And people with low subjective social status are more likely to support populist right-wing parties. And because over the last 30 years, non-college graduate, middle-aged men, they've been losing status, they feel they're losing out in society. And that's why in the last few years you see support for Trump, for Brexit, for all the populist right in many European countries. So that's one argument. This is the data, one figure they show, showing the 12 countries. But I think the result actually is not as clear-cut as they claim to be. Look at Hungary, so second row on the left, right? The black line is the relative social status of men in Hungary, right? So actually, Hungary is a country, by this measure, where non-college graduate middle-aged men, their relative status has been going up. But we have in Hungary, Viktor Orban have been in power for what, 10 years, right? And if you look at America, which is second row on the right, again, look at American men. I wouldn't say that there is a sort of a long-term decline in the social status of American men in this graph, would you? So I'm not quite convinced by the evidence that Gibron and Hall put forward, partly because that measure of social status is quite tricky. There's on the 10-rung ladder, something like 2/3 of the people put themselves at 4, 5, and 6. So everyone thinks that I'm kind of in the middle, right? So there's some measurement issue there. And also, the other thing is that you don't know what people are thinking when they are, assigning themselves on that ladder. So I'm proposed to use a slightly better measure of social status. This follows from the German social scientist from the 19th century, Max Weber. Weber argued that status expresses itself through connubium and commensality. Connubium is marriage. Commensality is sharing meal. So what he's saying is that it's through who do you eat with and who do you sleep with. Yeah, people you have intimate association with. That tells you who do you see as your social equal. So I'm going to run out of time quite soon. I'm going to skip a little bit, but I can come back to this measure later on. Basically, the idea is that we ask a sample of people their own occupation and the occupation of their best friends. So people's best friends are people the respondents see as their social equal. And we use a measure called multidimensional scaling to try to find a spatial representation of the status hierarchy from the data. And it turns out that results of the analysis are similar to what Edwardians in this country think about status. So professionals are on top of, non-menus are on top of menus. Within non-menus, professionals are above managers. Sort of people avoiding trade, right? Trade is somewhat, demeaning yourself. And status as measured by intimate association is quite different from what we call social class. So here I show distribution of status across the social class divided by the sociologist John Goldthorpe, and now adopted by the Office for National Statistics called as the UK official social classification. So on the left-hand side, these are what Goldthorpe called the salariate. These are salaried professionals and managers or maybe owners of fairly big business. On the right-hand side, class 5 and 6, they are menu workers. And you see there is a distribution of status within class, and there's also difference in status across classes. And the overlap in social status between class is quite considerable. And within one class, there's also people of higher or lower status. So as I said, you think of a depot manager, yeah? So this depot manager is managerial, so she would be a salariate, a member of the salariate. But he or she works in a menu setting, get herself dirty in the course of everyday work. Yeah. So according to our status measure, it turns out that they have lower status than people like me sitting behind a desk. Yeah. So that's how the data show up. It turns out that social class measured by NSAC and social status, as I try to give you an idea of, predict different things. Class predict economic outcome like who get unemployed in the recessions. It predicts how long your income will rise as you progress in your working life. When do you plateau in your income as you get older. But social status predict different things, including political attitudes. So if you ask people about taxation, public service, the bread and butter issues, class is the predictor. If you talk about sort of social moral issues like censorship, the death penalty, homosexuality, those sort of social moral issue is status, not class, which predict the outcome. So coming back to the Brexit question, if Brexit is really driven by a sort of economic left behind type of consideration, you would expect social class to be more important. But if Brexit is really about how you see the world, then it's status which is important. And then finally, we're going to look at some neighborhood differences. Of course, one key neighborhood variable we're going to talk about is the Chinese import shock, whether areas which have seen more Chinese import penetration, they are more likely to support Brexit. We also look at other general measure of economic deprivation using a measure by the sociologist Pete Townsend. And also we look at a percentage of migrants in different local areas. For these two variables, deprivation and migration, we look at the level in 2011 in the census, 2011 census. We also look at the change in the level of these two variables between 01 and 11. The idea is that maybe it's not level which matters, but change in the level which affect people's, how they think about the country. So just to summarize, we are looking at two narratives about Brexit. There's a left behind narrative. We'll see whether the Chinese import shock is a big factor. We'll see whether you live in a deprived area matter or not. We look at your social class position as an individual. We also have measure of income, so we look at whether people have household income which are below the 60% of the national median, relative poverty. There's another narrative which look at national identity and a general outlook. We have some measure of British and English national identity. We have measure of percentage of migrants in particular areas. We have measure of cultural consumption, and we have a measure of social status. So we have multiple tests for the two arguments, and we want to see which arguments are supported by the data. The data come from Understanding Society, which is the world's largest household panel survey, but it's based in the UK, carried out by a team based in University of Essex. It's available to all academics, so if you're interested, you can register and download the same data. I'll be happy to send you my statistical analysis file, and you can replicate the result that I get. In that survey in 2016-17, they asked the same question as on the ballot paper, which is, should the UK stay in the EU or leave the EU? Yeah, and people were given the same binary outcome. Notice that it's not really about how people actually voted in the referendum, because the survey is so big. So it takes more than one calendar year to do all the field work. So some people were interviewed months before the referendum, others were interviewed months after. So it's about people's attitude about UK's EU membership on the day they were interviewed. Yeah? So let's be clear about that. In terms of explanatory variable, we have a direct measure of British identity. Most people who live in the UK may think of themselves as being British in some way. How important is being British to you? 0 to 10. Pick a number from that, yeah? And then there's another question, a separate question, which asks, they show them a card and ask, what do you consider your national identity to be? You can choose as many as you like. On the card are British, English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, others or something, yeah? So based on their response, I grouped the respondent into 5 groups. People who say that I'm just British, people who say that I'm just English, and people who say that I'm Scottish or Welsh or Irish or Northern Irish. Yeah, that would be the 3rd category. And then people who say I'm British and English. And then there's a residual category of any other combination. Yeah. Cultural consumption variable is also from Understanding Society. There are 8 items on visual arts and music, and we carry out some analysis and group the respondent into 3 types. Yeah, cultural omnivores, univores, and palkivores. We have neighborhood characteristics. The second smallest census category is called lower layer super output area, LSOAs. I think each LSOA has something like 1,500, 2,000 people. It's fairly small. So for each LSOA, we have information about economic deprivation. We have information about how many foreign-born there are in the LSOA. As in 2011, but we also know the same variable from 10 years ago, so we can look at change in deprivation and percentage of migrants in those areas. And of course, we have the information about Chinese import shock taken from the paper from Colintoni and Stenick, and we also plug that into our analysis. And we take into account all these demographic characteristics like age, like sex, ethnicity, employment status, number of kids you have at home, and so on. So let's look at some of the results. Here I'm showing you how Brexit support varies by each of the key covariates, one by one, right? So on the horizontal axis is what percentage of people say they support Brexit, yeah? To the right is more Brexity, to the left is more Remainy, yeah? So on the left-hand side, you see an age gradient. Younger people are less Brexity than older folks, yeah? This we know from all the studies and newspaper report. On the right-hand side, it shows a geographical region. So the first line is Scotland. Within the UK, Scotland vote most Remainy, right? And then among the rest of Great Britain, you have London. The second line is London. It's also less Brexity, yeah? All other English regions are more supportive of Brexit compared with London. This we know from previous research. Here are 4 variables we think of as social stratification variable. Tell you something about inequality. You have education top left, social class top right, status bottom left, and whether you are in relative poverty bottom right. So again, you have the educational gradient. Better educated people are less supportive of Brexit. Yeah, it's a quite strong association. You also see a social gradient, a class gradient, a status gradient, and a difference by whether people are in relative poverty or not. People who are relatively poor are more supportive of Brexit, basically. So far, so good? So these are individual characteristics, right? I'm going to show you area characteristic, neighborhood characteristics. So top left is the Townsend Index. I think top is the least deprived, bottom line is the most deprived area. On the top right is change in the Townsend Index over 10 years. On the bottom left is percentage foreign born. Bottom right is change in percentage of foreign born. So the headline result here is that area association with Brexit support is generally a lot weaker than individual characteristics. At least if you look at the Townsend Index or the change in the Townsend Index, there is not a lot to write home about, right? There is some for percentage of foreign born. Actually, people living in area with a lot of foreign born in the local areas are least supportive of Brexit, yeah? Which I think it has been reported in previous research, but that's not how we might think of it. Like, you know, you live in an area with a lot of migrants, you react to it, and then you voted for Brexit. Yeah, people who live in an area where there is a lot of migrants are actually less supportive of Brexit. Change in the percentage of migrants, at least when considered on its own with Brexit support, there's not a strong, clear story to tell, right? This is the association between Brexit support and the China import shock. I would say that there is not a clear story here, right? It just jump around a little bit. It's hard to interpret a clear picture. How important is being British is the left-hand side. So if you think that being British is at least moderately important, so you pick your answer from 0 to 10, you pick from the top half of the scale, the more you think that being British is important, the more Brexity you are likely to be. But probably a lot of people, when answer this question, if they don't think that being British, you know, it's not something they think about, they just pick some answer in the bottom half, you know, between 0 and 5, right? So that's why probably you don't see a strong picture in that part of the curve. On the right-hand side, so the first line is people are, so let me remind you, we offer people a choice of multiple layered identity, yeah? So the first line is being British, yeah? When offer multiple identity, they just say, I'm just British. The second is, I'm just English. The third is other nationality in the British context, meaning Scottish, Welsh, Irish, etc. The fourth is, I'm British and English. And then the fifth is other combination. So what stands out is that compared to people who say that they are British, those who choose the English label are a lot more Brexity. In the middle, between British and English, is those who choose I'm British and English. Yeah, so say something about how people see themselves in relation to the UK, right? And this is the cultural consumption variable, right? So omnivore, the first line, paucivore in the middle, and univore at the bottom, right? So it's a very strong association about cultural consumption pattern and the attitude about the UK's membership in the EU. So what I show you so far is to consider Brexit support with all these variables one at a time. Now we want to take everything together and consider how they, so for example, take into account people's education and age, ethnicity, and so on. How does, for example, social class or living in London or not matter, right? So some of the results in this, what we call multivariate analysis, are consistent with the story that I'm sure you know. For example, there's a strong age gradient, there's a strong educational gradient. Younger people, more educated people generally are less supportive of Brexit, they're more pro-Remain. Yeah, that we know. Yeah, but there are other things which are not that well known. For example, once you take into account characteristic of the respondent, London doesn't stand out. Living in London doesn't stand out from other English region. There is no statistically significant difference between living in London and living in the north of England in terms of Brexit support, right? So at the moment, we have all these concerns about, some part of, at least within the Labour Party, the north seems to have deserted them. But, it has been pointed out, maybe it's not region, maybe it's the different composition of people living in different parts of the country, right? So far as Brexit support is concerned, once you take into account individual characteristics, London doesn't differ from the rest of Great Britain. And then with all these individual demographic characteristic control for, we want to see whether it is social class or social status which predict Brexit support. And it turns out that class doesn't really matter. It is status which matter. And on the right, I show you the magnitude of the status difference within each educational groups. So there are 6 lines here. The top are people with a BA degree or above. The bottom line are people with no qualification. Within each line, I show you Brexit support for people who are at the top of the status hierarchy marked by the cross. The solid dot are the people within that education level have the lowest status position, and the hollow dot are people in the middle of the status hierarchy. So between people with no qualification and with a degree, the status support, the Brexit support differ by something like 25 to 30 percentage points. Big difference, right? But within education level, the top and the bottom of the status hierarchy, the difference in Brexit support differ by something like 20 percentage points. Smaller than education, but it's still, a big impact. Then we take out class and status and plug in whether someone was in relative poverty or not. There are something like 19 or 18% of this sample who live in relative poverty, about 1/5 of the sample. And they are something between 6 or 7 percentage points more likely to support Brexit. So there is some truth that people in relative poverty are more likely to support Brexit, but the magnitude seems to be smaller. What about neighborhood deprivation? So remember, we have people living in small areas. We compute local deprivation and immigration. We show that, hang on, let me just, yes. People who live in area with different level of deprivation as measured by the Townsend Index, and the change in the Townsend Index between 2001 and 2011, that doesn't really predict Brexit. Yeah, neighborhood deprivation, once you take into account individual characteristics, who lives there, is not a big predictor of Brexit support. What predicts Brexit support, as I mentioned before, is percentage of people living in that area who are foreign-born, who are migrants. People living in area with more migrants are less supportive of Brexit. But people who live in area with increased share of migrants are more pro-Brexit. In fact, once you take into account the migrant share in local areas, London, actually compared with rest of England, are more pro-Brexit. The regional, the estimate for London changed sign. So sometimes we think of Brexit as a London and region contrast, right? So once you look at individual characteristics, the picture becomes more complex. So Londoner, don't blame yourself. There is this measure about whether you think being British is important to you, right? The left graph shows that something like a 20 percentage point difference between people who say that being British is really important, 10 out of 10, compared to people who say 1 out of 10, right? But as we have seen before, if you give people a choice, being English, being British, or just being British, you see a more nuanced picture. Again, people who see themselves, who are just British, are less pro-Brexit than people who see themselves as English. So it's something about how people see themselves within the UK. Cultural omnivores, etc., are also big predictors. It's something like if you have a university degree and if you are omnivores, the probability of you supporting Brexit is only 20%. Yeah, but if you are a univore, is 36%. So that's a 16-point difference. It's a big deal. The China import shock is at the cups of statistical significance. And for example, if you take someone with an A level, depends on where this person lives. If this person lives in an area where the Chinese import shock is at its lowest, the probability of supporting Brexit is 0.44. But if this person lives in an area where the Chinese import shock is strongest in the whole UK, the probability is 10 points higher. So there's something there. But once you take into account cultural value, national identity, etc., the Chinese import shock index no longer predict Brexit. Yeah, it could be a chance variation. So some of you in the audience, if you know data analysis, you might raise the question, maybe all these other variables is just mediating the Chinese import shock index, right? So people living in area where there is a lot of Chinese import, maybe they do different cultural things. They're more likely to think of themselves as English rather than British. But it turns out that all these other cultural values and identity variables are essentially uncorrelated with the Chinese import shock. So let me summarize my result, and we could have a little bit more time for discussion later on. So this analysis confirms some of the results reported in previous studies. For example, there's a strong age and educational gradient in support for Brexit. But we also report some new results. For example, once you take into account who lives where and the characteristics of the individuals, there is no regional difference within England in Brexit support. In fact, once you control for how many migrants there are in different parts of the country, the English regions are actually less pro-leave than London. There is some support for the left behind argument, but the support is not always consistent. We show that being relatively poor show up as something between 6 or 7 percentage points more likely to support leave. There is some support for the Chinese import argument, but it depends on how you, what else did you take into account in the statistical model. What is quite clear is that if you measure local deprivation according to the Townsend Index, it really doesn't predict Brexit, nor the social class of individuals. On its own, there is a class gradient, but once you take into social status, class just become, all over the place. Yeah. There's a good deal of support. It's really about how people see the world. So whether they take a more cosmopolitan or more insular view of the world. So I already said that status, not class, predict leave support. People who think that being British is really important, they are more likely to support Brexit. But if you offer people a choice between being British or English, people who say that I'm British rather than English, these are more pro-Remain people. So I think what I want to say here is that, you know, national identity clearly is important, but national identity is not just a simple label that people carry around. People can have multiple levels of national identity. It depends on how national identity is articulated. Yeah, that matters in terms of Brexit support. Cultural consumption probably is a good measure of general outlook, whether people take a more sort of a tolerant cosmopolitan view or not. That is a strong predictor of Brexit. For educational attainment is important, but it is not between graduate on the one hand and everybody else on the other. Each steps of the education ladder, you know, there is a slight change in the level of Brexit support. Immigration is interesting. The effect of immigration is quite subtle. People living in an area where there is a concentration of migrants are actually less pro-leave. So, but people who, well, this result may be consistent with, there is a psychological literature called the contact hypothesis. Basically, it says that people who have good contact with members of the out-group, in the long run, they form, you know, a good opinion of the out-group. So it improves inter-group relationship with contact. It is also possible that this result comes from a selection, right? Migrants tend to settle in areas that they think they get a good reception from the natives, right? So it could be one or the other or both. But we also see the finding that if you live in an area where migration level has gone up, people are more pro-Brexit. This might suggest a sort of a local capacity issues. Maybe there are more migrants in the area that really pose problem in terms of getting your kids into local schools, or, you know, the local, you know, how long it takes to see your local GP. There may be a capacity issue of that kind that need addressing, right? But it is also important to point out that people react to change, right? If people react to change, it is possible that people can get used to change, right? So when is the UK is not undergoing change, you know, there's always change going on, right? People might get used to the local level of migration. So it's a politics, it's a political issue, right? It depends on whether we have people who articulate a case for assimilation, accommodation or not, right? So here is my email address. I have a copy of the paper. If you send me an email, I'm very happy to send you the paper. I better stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Wing. What a fascinating analysis. And I think the brilliant presentation of some very complex data has really spoken to all of us in many different ways. So thank you for that. It is our tradition with these professorial lectures to follow them with a brief response from an academic colleague before we all share our thoughts over a drink. I'm very pleased to introduce our respondent for this evening, Dr. Stephen Fisher, Associate Professor of Political Sociology and Fellow and Tutor in Politics at Trinity College, University of Oxford. Stephen's research focuses on political attitudes and behaviour, especially in relation to elections and voting in Britain and elsewhere. If we look across Stephen's recent research and publications, we see reflected back to us just what a rich seam of material British politics has provided him with over the past decade, from the accountability challenges of coalition government to wide-of-the-mark opinion polling and, of course, the EU referendum. Stephen, thank you for being our respondent. Please can I invite you to offer your reflections on Wing's lecture and the issues it has raised for us. Stephen.
Thank you very much. Certainly has been a lot of material, and there's a lot of material in this wonderful lecture that Wing's kindly given us. The more I read this paper, the more I like it. There's so much great stuff in it, and it's makes contributions to our understanding of the Brexit referendum and British society and politics on lots of levels, on the theoretical level and on an empirical level. So for me, one of the key contributions of the paper is it's been very clear about how it understands this term left behind. A lot of the earlier writers on the notion of left behind in British politics have quickly modelled economic and cultural things. So, for instance, one pollster in advance of the 2015 general election, when trying to introduce the idea of left behind, started by saying that there are some people who don't understand why all caramel needs to be salted and all pork needs to be pulled. And this was an example of how they've been left behind by the contemporary culture of food. I mean, on that basis, I was left behind in the late 1990s when I failed to appreciate why all tomatoes had to be sun-dried. There's a clear definition of left behind in this paper on the economic side, and I think that's a sensible choice. The paper's also very good at distinguishing between social class as an economic concept and social status as a cultural concept. And that's a valuable contribution that allows us to assess and separate those two ideas and their relationship to Brexit voting. And it turned out to be that social status mattered much more than social class. Thirdly, the paper is organised around economic versus cultural, but within cultural it goes more in depth than any other paper that I know of and any other research in delineating different kinds of cultural factors that are related to Brexit voting. So there's national identity, there's social status, which you mentioned already, there's cultural consumption, and all of these, I think, need to be mulled over and thought about much more, because on the empirical side, the paper does a very powerful job of showing that these factors are much more important than the economic factors in understanding who voted for Brexit and who voted against it. And that is still extremely relevant. I mean, it's not only as a historical landmark in British politics, which we'll be thinking about and learning about for a long time, but we've now had 2 general elections since the Brexit referendum, and both those general elections have been marked by an increasing organisation of Leave voters on the one hand now voting for the Conservative Party and Remain voters voting for Labour, Liberal Democrats, SNP, Greens, a host of what were at this last election pro-second referendum parties. And at the last election, the Conservatives got a big majority, but they got a big majority off the back of 45% of the vote. The majority of votes went for the pro-referendum parties. And the politics of Brexit is not over, at least at the elite level. We will now have, we'll be leaving the European Union at the end of the month. We'll be in a transition period during which we're supposedly negotiating free trades with the US and the EU at record speed. They'll be concluded by the summer, and we'll be in a new relationship with these countries by the end of the year, according to the government. The government will be having to respond to public opinion. It's clearly concerned about keeping their own voters on side, and their own voters are Leave voters. So we now have this paradox of an Etonian Prime Minister managing to speak to relatively low social status, as Wings and his colleagues' paper shows us, relatively nationalist voters. It's very easy to understand how this Prime Minister can talk an English nationalist language to the people who voted for him, and it will be it's not hard to imagine that carrying on. But how long the sort of culture can continue to dominate the economic will be one of the big stories. There's a lot of talk about rebalancing the economy, and a lot of that talk is about infrastructure spending in the north and some of these locations where the Conservatives won seats that traditionally Labour and are relatively deprived. But Wing and his colleagues' papers show that it's actually what matters about those places was not so much their location and their status as deprived communities, but the people that live in them. And there's not enough talk on that basis of actually measures that will bring more people out of relative poverty. And so whether the current plans to rebalance will really satisfy the Leave voters in these northern, formerly Labour Leave seats is another important question that this paper raises, and we shall see how it plays out. Another part of the Prime Minister's rhetoric is to unify the country. That was the rhetoric he gave when he became Prime Minister. We haven't heard much of it recently. But there is a question in this paper as to how do we unify the country when some people identify as British and more European and a more cosmopolitan outlook, whereas others are less so or not at all. And it is a particular challenge for the Labour Party that has a more cosmopolitan, pro-European, pro-immigration outlook to try and speak to and win over voters that don't share those values as much as they do themselves. So there's a lot of big, profound questions that this paper, for British politics, this paper speaks to and raises the salience of, and will help us understand in future and help us understand future developments in British politics. So thank you very much to Wing and his co-authors.
Well, it just leaves me to say thank you very much to our speaker and respondent. That was brilliant. And as you say, Stephen, interesting times and very thought-provoking. And so can I now please invite you all to join us for a drink and further conversation. Thank you very much for being here for what I think has been a fantastic event.